In a prosperous kingdom lived Prince Torin, the king's youngest son. From an early age, his elder brother had been preparing to inherit the crown, and already knew how to listen to advisers, as though he heard not their words, but the very fate of the realm. The middle brother commanded the armies, feared no distant campaigns, and returned home with the dust of the roads upon his cloak. Torin, too, knew everything a prince was expected to learn. He spoke eloquently, sat confidently in the saddle, read ancient books, and remembered the lineages of neighbouring houses. Yet the more he knew how to do, the more strongly he felt that, in truth, he could do nothing at all. His hands had held a quill and reins, but never a task he had begun for himself. Every path had been laid before him, every role assigned. And more often Torin wondered, what use was he to a world in which not a single true undertaking remained for him? The next morning, Torin went to his father in the small hall where the king usually examined letters and petitions. "I ask for your blessing," said the prince. "Let me set out on a journey." The king laid down his quill and gazed at his youngest son for a long while. "Do you seek glory, lands, a bride?" "None of those," Torin replied. "I shall travel to the harsh north, where life is simple and honest. I will enter the service of an ordinary man, work with my own hands, and learn what I am worth without a name, a title, or royal protection." He asked not for gold for the road, but for permission to become poor, so that he might gain a wealth no treasury could hold. The king understood that this was no youthful whim, but his son's first mature choice. Sadly, he embraced Torin and then blessed his journey. Torin put on a plain woolen jacket, hid his hair beneath a travelling hood, and left the palace alone early in the morning. At first, the road passed through flowering valleys, orchards, and level fields, where the wind gently stirred the heads of grain. Then the settlements grew fewer, the hedges vanished, and grey stone crunched beneath his feet instead of hard-packed earth. Day after day, he travelled north. The spruce forests were quiet. They smelled of resin, damp moss, and cold bark. Now and then, heavy drops fell from the branches, their sparse tapping accompanying his steps. At last the forest opened. Desolate fjords lay before Torin, dark cliffs, grey water, white gulls, and a salt-laden wind. With every mountain pass he crossed, his former life receded farther, like a shore slowly disappearing into mist. Toward evening, Torin was walking beside a narrow fjord, when he noticed something among the grey mountains, unlike anything he had ever seen. High above the water loomed an enormous stone structure, as though it had been hewn not by the hands of craftsmen, but by the cliff itself. Its walls merged seamlessly into the mountainside, and its roof was a broad ledge covered with moss and low grass. A steady plume of smoke rose from its single chimney and slowly dissolved into the cold air. The house did not seem forbidding. It breathed of antiquity, strength, and a peace so deep that it seemed the mountain kept its heart there. This was not the house of a man who had conquered the rock, but the house of the rock itself, which had allowed someone to dwell within it. Torin knew that this was precisely the sort of place he had been seeking. He climbed the stone path to ask for shelter and work. Torin raised the heavy iron knocker and struck the enormous oak door. The blow rolled dully through the stone vaults. The door was opened by a man so tall and powerful that the prince had to lift his head to look at him. His hair was grey as snow upon the peaks, his face weathered like a cliff, and his calm eyes resembled heavy boulders. Throughout the surrounding lands, he was known as the Master of the Mountains. "I am a traveller," Torin said, without giving his name. "I ask for a night's shelter, and if there is work to be done, take me into your service." The master remained silent for a long time, studying his guest, as though testing a stone before striking it with a hammer. "There is not much work here," he said at last, "but every task must be done properly. If you can manage that, you may stay." He spoke slowly and weightily, like the mountain itself. "I agree," Torin replied. The Master of the Mountains stepped aside and opened the way for him to enter. During his first days, Torin split firewood, carried water, and helped the Master of the Mountains in the distant stone halls. The house seemed endless. Stairways descended into the depths, corridors vanished into twilight, and at times a low, steady rumble could be heard beyond the thick walls. One day, Torin noticed a door that was firmly closed but not locked. A strange, warm light streamed from behind it. Carefully, he peered through the narrow opening. 3 cauldrons stood in a vast, dark kitchen. Not a single log burned beneath them, yet each one boiled and bubbled heavily. Molten copper shimmered in the first, radiant silver in the second, and gold churned in the third and largest. Heat poured from the cauldrons, and golden reflections trembled across the walls, as though an unseen heart of fire beat in the depths of the mountain. Torin realized that it was not food being cooked there, but the metals themselves, and that untamed magic served as the hearth fire. Torin could not tear his gaze from the gleaming cauldrons, but soon he noticed another room beyond them, quiet, clean, and filled with an even golden light. A young woman sat at a large loom. She wore a plain linen dress, and her fair hair was bound in a tight braid. She resembled none of the court ladies Torin had known. She wore no ornaments and displayed no studied grace, yet her hands moved swiftly and precisely, as though every thread already knew its place. This was Solveig, the maiden artisan. She raised her eyes and looked directly at Torin. She did not start, frown, or ask how he had come there. Her clear gaze held a calm knowing, as though she had long awaited this moment and already understood why he had come. And Torin understood that if the Master of the Mountains was the strength of this house, Solveig was its living and wise soul. Torin realized that he had been silent too long. He stepped back from the door as if intending to leave, but then stopped. "Why are you here alone?" he asked. Solveig grew still. The threads ceased gliding across the loom, and the room became so quiet that only the boiling metals beyond the wall could be heard. She studied Torin more closely, as though seeing in him for the first time more than a chance intruder. Others had asked her about the wondrous cauldrons. They had also asked about her work, the secrets of the house, and the power of the Master of the Mountains. But no one had ever asked about her loneliness. "I guard this house," she answered after a pause, "and it guards me." A barely perceptible sorrow sounded in her voice. Torin did not question her further, yet a quiet understanding had already arisen between them, the first bridge between two people accustomed to living by the rules of others. The following morning, the Master of the Mountains led Torin into an old stone stable. Beneath its low vaults lay matted straw, dust, broken mangers, and a layer of filth so thick that it seemed no one had entered for 100 years. "This is your task," said the Master. "By evening, it must be as clean as a royal chamber." Torin took up a pitchfork and set to work without fear. He raked the straw, carried out rubbish, and broke apart hardened clods. But each time he threw another armful through the door, a dry rustle sounded behind him. The straw returned to its former place. Dust rose from the cracks, and the grime seemed to crawl out of the stone itself. Torin worked hour after hour, until his hands trembled with exhaustion. Yet the stable only grew dirtier. At noon, he lowered the pitchfork. For the first time, he understood that diligence might not be enough when one did not understand the laws of the work itself. In utter despair, Torin returned to the closed part of the house and knocked softly on the door. Solveig let him in without unnecessary questions, and silently listened to his account of the stable, that grew dirtier with every effort he made. "You are trying to fight the house," she said with a faint smile. "But you need not fight it. You must come to an understanding with it. You want to cleanse it by force, when you ought to help it breathe out everything old." She picked up a pitchfork that rested against the wall and turned it upside down. "Work with the handle, not the tines, and draw it towards you rather than pushing it away. Change the motion, and the work itself will change." Torin frowned. The advice seemed strange and almost meaningless. But there was neither mockery nor doubt in Solveig's calm gaze. So he thanked her and returned to the stable, determined to trust her. Torin returned to the stable, turned the pitchfork upside down, and drew its handle across the matted straw, pulling it toward himself rather than pushing it away. At first, nothing happened. Then the old bedding shuddered and slowly crept toward the door. The dust settled, the grime withdrew from the walls, and the stable seemed to breathe out the burden it had held for many years. While Torin worked, Solveig came to her door and left it slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening, they spoke of distant worlds. He told her of the palace garden beside the warm southern sea, of its white paths and roses fragrant after sunset. She listened, and then confessed that since childhood, she had dreamed of seeing an ordinary summer rain, warm and gentle, with no stinging snow. Her dream touched Torin in a way he had not expected. Thus, between south and north, a bridge was taking shape, built not of stone, but of trust. That evening, the Master of the Mountains entered the stable and stopped upon the threshold. The stone walls were clean, the mangers washed, and not a scrap of old straw remained on the floor. He frowned, concealing his surprise. The next morning, the master said, "Bring me my horse. He grazes high upon the stony meadows. But take care. His breath is fire, and his nature is wild." Torin was already imagining how he would struggle with the monstrous beast. But first he went to Solveig. "Strength will not help you here," she said. "His fury is only fear." From an old chest, she took a tarnished silver bridle and handed it to Torin. "Do not force it onto him. Approach slowly and let the horse take the first step toward you. And whatever happens, do not pull upon the reins." Torin took the bridle and understood that now he would have to master not the horse, but his own impatience. Torin climbed to the high stony meadows, where the air was cold and clear, and the sparse grass trembled in the wind. There, at the edge of a precipice, grazed a horse whose coat was the colour of molten copper. Hot vapour like smoke streamed from his nostrils. At the sight of a man, the horse flung up his head, neighed, and struck the ground furiously with one hoof. Stones tumbled down the slope. Torin felt his hand move instinctively toward his sword. But then he remembered Solveig's words. He approached slowly, holding the silver bridle before him, then stopped a few paces away. "I will not hurry you," he said softly. The horse snorted and watched him sidelong, but Torin did not move. Gradually, the creature's hot breathing grew even. At last, the copper stallion took one step, then another, and lowered his head of his own accord. Before the long journey down, Torin carefully slipped on the bridle. Thus he returned the horse to the Master of the Mountains, not conquered, but trusting. That evening, Torin led the copper horse to the stone house. The Master of the Mountains examined the silver bridle nodded grimly, and without a word, led the stallion into the stable. Solveig was waiting at the door to her room, but this time she did not remain behind the threshold. She came to Turin and smiled so warmly that his weariness receded. "I like to watch you learn," she said. "You do not pretend to be all-powerful, and you are not ashamed to ask for advice. That is a rare gift in a prince. You know how to listen. And your counsel is wiser than all the books in my father's library," Turin replied. Beside her for the first time, he felt no desire to seem stronger or wiser than he was. And Solveig had met, for the first time, a man who valued her knowledge and did not fear it. That evening they no longer spoke through a crack in the door, but stood side by side. On the third day, the Master of the Mountains summoned Turin to the deepest hall of the house. His voice sounded especially grave. "You have accomplished what others could not. Now bring me a gift of fire from the underground forge beyond the distant pasture. Its entrance is hidden within the rock." Ancient legends were told of that forge. It was said that the primal fire of the earth burned in its furnaces and remembered every sword, plough, lock, and wondrous object ever made by human hands or magic. There, metal heard the thoughts of the craftsman, and the flames tested his heart. To enter unprepared was to awaken a power capable not only of burning the body, but of turning to ash everything a person hid from himself. Turin understood that this was the greatest trial. He did not pretend to be brave, but went at once to Solveig. He trusted her enough to ask how he might enter the fiery memory of the world and return as himself. Solveig listened to Turin and said, "The forge's fire is generous, but it does not abide greed. You may ask for any gift, but you must take only as much as you can carry yourself, in your own hands, without another's help." Turin thanked her and went to the cliff. Beyond a stone door, a fiery hall opened before him. Heaps of gold lay upon its ledges, armor gleamed, and swords that gave off a soft ringing stood along the walls. Each promised power, glory, and great victories. But Turin remembered Solveig's words. He did not try to prove his strength to the fire, nor did he ask for treasure. Instead, he chose a small but heavy pouch of gold dust, exactly as much as he could carry in both hands. And the fort allowed him to leave, because he had come for a gift, not for the whole world. Turin returned from the underground forge and set the small pouch of gold dust before the Master of the Mountains. For several moments, the Master was silent. Then his expression darkened. He understood that the young man had done more than simply obey an order. Someone had taught him to see the hidden meaning of each trial, not to grasp at more than he needed, and to trust his own judgment. Slowly, the Master turned his head towards Solveig's door. For the first time, his weighty calm deserted him. Cold fury flashed in his eyes. He regarded the maiden artisan as part of his house, as unchanging as the stone walls and the fire in the mountain's depths. But now hope lived in her silence, and her gaze held a readiness to leave. To the master, the little pouch seemed not a gift, but a sentence. Torin had not taken gold from him. He was returning to Solveig the right to choose, and with it, the power the Master of the Mountains had believed eternal was beginning to crumble. The Master of the Mountains no longer concealed his decision. He ordered Solveig to be summoned, and without looking at Torin, said in an icy voice, "In the morning, he will leave my house, and you, as its faithful keeper, will prepare his farewell meal." Solveig raised her eyes. The master looked at her for so long, and with such weight, that no explanation was needed. She knew of the potion of oblivion, kept in a stone cabinet behind 3 locks. A few drops in wine were enough to make a person forget his name, the road he had travelled, and even who he had wished to become. After the meal, Torin would remember neither her nor the house beneath the mountain, nor the lessons that had taught him to listen, to trust, and to know when enough was enough. He would return to his former life, as lost as he had been before. The master had decided to take not his life, but his memory. And then Solveig understood that they could not wait until morning. After hearing the Master of the Mountain's command, Solveig returned to her room, and for the first time, did not sit down at the loom. She stood amid the silence, and clearly saw the truth from which she had turned away for so many years. She was called the Keeper, entrusted with the secrets of the house, and surrounded by rare metals and ancient magic. But all of it was only a beautiful cage. The master valued her skill as long as it served him, and he would never allow her to choose her own path. In the past, Solveig had known how to wait, endure, and find wise counsel for others. Now counsel was not enough. The time had come to act. She went to Torin and said quietly, "Tonight we leave." There was no fear in her voice. By surrendering familiar safety for freedom and love, Solveig became, for the first time, not the keeper of another's house, but the mistress of her own fate. Late that night, Solveig met Torin in an empty corridor and told him about the potion of oblivion and the command of the Master of the Mountains. "Then we shall leave together," he replied without hesitation. Solveig returned to her room and began to prepare. She touched neither the gold, nor the silver, nor the precious fabrics. Instead of treasure, she placed in her travelling bag a small pouch of sea salt, a flask of clear spring water, and 3 red amber beads that could repeat words they had heard. Last of all, she carefully wrapped in a linen cloth a golden apple that had once grown in her secret garden. Torin wanted to ask why they needed these strange things, but Solveig only said, "On the road, they will speak for themselves." She was gathering not riches with which to buy freedom, but magic with which to protect it. Each object was part of a spell not yet spoken. That night, when the wind began to moan through the stone passageways, Solveig slipped silently into the dark kitchen. The cauldrons no longer shone. Only a faint warmth rose from the hearth. She took out the 3 red echo beads and placed them on a wooden bench. Bending close to the first, she whispered, "I am here." She instructed the second to answer, "I am coming." And to the third, she entrusted the most important words, "I have not gone anywhere." The beads trembled softly, as though they had remembered not only her voice, but also the habitual calm with which she always answered the master. Torin was waiting by a hidden exit. Solveig closed the little stone door behind her, and they slipped out into the cold night. Without lighting a lantern, the fugitives descended the narrow path and set out towards the distant sea, where the wind could hide their tracks. The house was left with silence, and 3 small voices, ready to lie for the sake of their freedom. Torin and Solveig reached the shore of the fjord just before dawn. In the reeds between dark boulders, they found a small fishing boat that smelled of wet wood and salt. Torin pushed it off the stones, helped Solveig aboard, and took up the oars. The boat glided gently into the grey water. Silence lay all around. Mist drifted over the smooth surface, hiding the shores. And somewhere far away, gulls called to one another. The only sounds were the steady splash of the oars and the soft rustle of salty spray against the side of the boat. Torin rowed steadily and without haste. Solveig watched the scattered stars and the direction of the cold wind, guiding them between the rocks. Sometimes their eyes met, and each was comforted by the other's silent presence. They did not have to return by evening and await someone else's command. For the first time, they chose their own direction. In that boat, they were no longer a prince and an imprisoned artisan, but 2 free people beginning a journey together. Meanwhile, the Master of the Mountains sat in the great hall, certain that the fugitives were still beneath his roof. Before him stood an empty cup and an untouched plate. An hour passed. "Solveig, is the farewell meal ready?" he shouted. In the kitchen, the first red bead flared. "I have only just begun, Master," it answered in Solveig's voice. Another hour passed. "How much longer must I wait?" The second bead trembled. "It is almost ready, Master." By the 3rd hour, the Master of the Mountains had lost all patience. "Solveig." The 3rd bead obediently replied, "Everything is finished, Master." He burst into the kitchen and froze. The tables were bare, the hearth was cold, and 3 lifeless beads lay upon the bench. Thus the mighty ruler of the mountains believed an echo 3 times and understood only too late that no one remained in his house to answer him. When he discovered the empty kitchen, the Master of the Mountains roared so loudly that the stone vaults trembled. He rushed outside, climbed to the top of the cliff, and saw a tiny boat far out in the grey fjord. He stretched out his hands, and a mighty wind rose over the water. But it blew not forward, but backward toward the house. The waves turned, and the water began to drain from the fjord, exposing black stones and the slippery bottom. The boat was pulled toward the shore, and Tauren's oars nearly ceased to obey him. Solvi was not afraid. She took out the pouch of sea salt, pinched a few grains between her fingers, and cast them into the receding water. At once, a dazzling white mountain rose before the wind. It towered from the very bottom of the fjord to the clouds. The wind struck it, howled, and scattered into powerless gusts. The boat rocked once more upon the freed water and sailed onward. The Master of the Mountains saw the wind shatter against the mountain of salt, and his fury grew more terrible still. He descended to the foot of the white barrier and began breaking it apart with his own hands. His stone fingers crushed the salt, and little by little the mountain sank. Solvi understood that they could not delay. She took out the flask of clear spring water and let a single drop fall into the exposed bed of the fjord. The drop touched the stone and unfolded into a vast wave. Yet the water returned without thunder or foam. It rose quietly, deeply, and evenly, filled with silver moonlight, even though day was already dawning over the mountains. The boat floated gently upward. A thick mist gathered around it, hiding the fugitives from the eyes of the Master of the Mountains. Thus one drop of clear water overcame the sea of his wrath, and the pursuit was left behind. After a long journey, Tauren and Solvi at last saw the towers of his native palace. At the gates, the prince shone with happiness. Only a little longer, and he would present to his father the woman with whom he had shared danger and freedom. But at the very entrance, Tauren glanced at her plain travelling dress, darkened by sea salt, and remembered the strict customs of the court. "My love, you must not enter on foot like a servant," he said. "Wait for me at the old lighthouse for just 1 hour. I will bring a golden carriage, the finest horses, and garments worthy of a queen." Solvi wanted to object, but she saw only love in his eyes and a desire to honour her. And so she nodded in silence. Tauren hurried to the palace, not realizing that for the first time since their journey began, he had chosen ceremony over closeness. He wished to give her a triumphal entrance, forgetting that their true triumph would have been to enter their new life side by side. Solveig took Tauren's hand before he could leave. "Do not go," she asked softly. "Do not leave me here alone. Let us enter together just as we came. Torin smiled tenderly. You have nothing more to fear. This is my home. But Solveig sensed a barely perceptible tension around the palace, as though someone's magic had stretched one last slender thread towards them. Very well, she said with a heavy heart. But give me your word. Do not enter the palace. Wait for me at the gates. And above all, eat and drink nothing offered by your family until I am beside you. Torin thought her concern needless, but he saw her face grow pale. I swear it, he replied. I shall do exactly as you say. Solveig released his hand. She could only trust that his promise would prove stronger than old habits. That day, the palace was celebrating the wedding of Torin's eldest brother. The moment he appeared at the gates, shouts of joy rang out. His family surrounded him, embracing him and plying him with questions, giving him no chance to move away. Torin remembered the promise he had made to Solveig. He was about to break free of the close circle and return to the old lighthouse, when his younger sister ran up to him. Brother, you have returned. You must be hungry. Eat at least one apple from our garden. She held out a large rosy fruit that an unknown peddler had brought to the palace that morning. Torin hesitated, but it seemed cruel to refuse his beloved sister. One bite cannot do any harm, he thought, and bit into the apple. At once his eyes went blank. Solveig, the house beneath the mountain, the boat, the sea, and the promise he had made, all vanished as though they had never existed. The last thread of enchantment, hidden in the apple and offered by a loving hand, had reached its mark. Solveig remained beside the old lighthouse, where the cold wind stirred her travelling cloak. 1 hour passed, then another. The sun slowly descended into the sea, and lights appeared in the palace's distant towers. Music, laughter, and the pealing of wedding bells drifted from the palace. Every sound caused her pain, for Torin still had not returned. By nightfall, Solveig already knew that the final trap of the Master of the Mountains had been sprung. Through no will of his own, Torin had broken his promise and forgotten the road back to her. But she did not leave. Until morning, Solveig watched the dark road, hoping to see even the glow of carriage lanterns. No one came. At dawn, the sea became grey and still. Solveig did not weep. Her face remained calm, but in her clear eyes lay the cold sorrow of one who had been left alone once more, and who still refused to let grief break her. When the sun rose over the sea, Solveig understood that she could wait no longer. She could return to the Master of the Mountains, admit defeat, and shelter once more behind stone walls. Or she could depart for distant lands where no one knew her pain. But neither path seemed right. I will not burst into the palace and beg him to believe me, she thought. His memory is locked, and such doors cannot be opened by another person's words. Solveig decided to remain nearby. She would not wait to be rescued, or live on hope alone, but build a new life for herself, an honest and free life that belonged to her. She took the road that led not away from the palace, but alongside its lands, and began to search for a place to make a home. She did not knock upon the locked door of his memory. She chose to build her own house nearby, so that one day Torin would have somewhere to return. Not far from the palace grove, Solveig found an old weaver's cottage. Its roof sagged, its windows were dim with dust, and inside it smelled of cold ashes and dry wood. She opened the shutters, swept the floor, and lit the stove. The logs began to crackle softly. A thin plume of smoke rose through the chimney. And for the first time in many years, the walls began to grow warm. Then Solveig climbed onto the roof, replaced the cracked tiles, and sealed the gaps with moss. In one corner, she found an old loom, cleared away the cobwebs, oiled its wooden parts, and soon the shuttle was gliding once more with a soft, steady knock. Then Solveig took out the pouch of gold dust Torin had brought from the underground forge. She did not exchange it for coins. Beneath her fingers, the dust stretched into the finest gleaming threads. Thus the abandoned house found warmth again, and Solveig began to weave the fabric of her new life, free, quiet, and fashioned by her own hands. Time passed. In the little cottage near the palace grove, Solveig lived by her labor. She wove strong cloth, mended tools, and always found a quiet, sensible solution where others had already given up. Word of the artisan quickly spread through the capital. A blacksmith came to her when his steel persistently cracked in the water. Then a saddler brought a torn harness that no needle could pierce. A young mother asked her to repair an old cradle that had preserved the warmth of several generations. Solveig turned no one away. She listened, worked without haste, and beneath her hands, metal grew strong. Leather became whole once more, and wooden rockers began to sway gently. She did not hide from life or wait for the past to return. She created the present herself. And though Solveig wore no crown, the people honored her as a queen of skillful hands and a wise heart. Meanwhile, preparations were underway at the palace for Torin's wedding to a bride chosen by the advisors. A carriage, decorated with ribbons, already stood in the courtyard. The musicians tuned their instruments, and the guests awaited the groom's appearance. But the moment the coachman took up the reins, the strongest leather fastening on the lead horse's harness snapped. The court saddlers laboured over it for a long time and finally replaced it with a new one. Then one of the carriage wheels cracked for no reason and fell into splinters, as though the wood had aged 100 years in a single minute. The craftsman fitted a spare wheel, inspected every spoke, and ordered the carriage to set off, but the horses did not take a single step. They stood motionless, breathing heavily, as though an invisible wall had risen before them. The courtyard fell silent. Even the advisers ceased their arguments. It seemed that fate itself was breaking leather and wood, holding the wedding carriage in place to give a forgotten love one last chance and prevent another mistake. The court craftsmen tried everything, but the carriage would not move. Then the old saddler remembered the young woman who lived near the grove, the artisan who knew how to restore strength and order to things. The king immediately sent for her. Solveig entered the courtyard calmly and with quiet composure. Turin stood beside his bride, but did not recognize her. She gave no sign of distress and merely examined the harness, the wheel, and the uneasy horses in silence. From her bag, Solveig took a sturdy iron pin, an ashwood crossbar, and a small figure of a golden bull. The pin secured the straps, the crossbar strengthened the wheel, and she placed the bull before the horses. Not a single spell was spoken, yet the harness held. The wheel ceased to creak, and the horses calmed and moved smoothly forward. Solveig came to the palace not as a forgotten bride, but as an artisan whose hands were trusted more than the splendor of the court. Grateful that the carriage had been saved, Turin himself ordered that the unknown artisan be invited to the wedding feast. Solveig sat at the farthest table among the servants and musicians, and remained quiet and unnoticed throughout the evening. When the cups had been filled again, and the hall swelled with merriment, she took the golden apple from her travelling bag and placed it before her. Then she opened her hands and released 2 little golden birds she had forged during the long winter evenings. The birds came to life, fluttered onto the table, and began to peck at the gleaming fruit. "Do you remember the house beneath the mountain?" one asked. "And the 3 tasks for which the artisan guided the young man?" the other replied. They spoke of the wild horse, the underground forge, the nighttime escape, the boat amid the mist, the mountain of salt, and the oath beside the old lighthouse. With every word, Turin grew paler. The noise of the feast receded. The birds' voices became the voice of his own soul, calling from the depths of oblivion. He stood motionless, looking at Solveig, and for the first time, a painful recognition kindled in his eyes. As he listened to the golden birds, Turin remembered everything. He looked at Solveig, and his eyes held pain, remorse, and love. But first, he went to his bride. "Forgive me," he said softly. "I nearly bound your life to a man whose heart had already made its choice." He released her from their promise, then stopped before Solveig. "Do not forgive me for the spell I could not resist," Turin said. "Forgive me for the lighthouse. I wanted to bring you home in the proper fashion instead of simply walking in beside you. Solveig saw that at last he understood his mistake, and she forgave him. They were married later, quietly, beside the sea. Their first home was the weaver's cottage, where Torin learned a craft, patience, and a simple wisdom. Not to hurry, to trust, and always to remain close. High in the mountains, where the clouds touched the peaks, lived Mulador and his wife Fila. Their cozy cave was hidden among pine trees and sun-warmed stones. In the mornings, Mulador caught silvery fish in the clear river, while Fila sheared the sheep, combed their soft wool, and spun it in the evenings beside a quietly crackling fire. They had no children, but a gentle silence lived in their home. One day, a lion appeared by a mountain pond. He did not roar or raise his paws, but bowed his heavy mane and allowed Mulador to give him water from his cupped hands. The next morning, a lion and lioness came to the cave. Between them stood a basket with a baby inside. The animals carefully left it on the threshold and silently walked away, like wise messengers who had fulfilled an ancient purpose unknown to anyone. In this way, the wilderness entrusted its most precious gift to humankind. Mulador carefully lifted the basket, and Fila pressed the baby to her breast and carried her into the cave, where the embers were still softly crackling. When the old couple unfolded the soft swaddling cloths, they saw a small birthmark on the girl's chest, delicate and distinct, like a royal crown drawn by destiny itself. They looked at one another and understood that the child must have come from a noble, perhaps even royal family. But neither fear nor greed touched their hearts. To them, she was not the heir to a distant throne, but a helpless gift entrusted to their love. When the girl began to cry, her voice rang out pure and clear, like the gentle call of a lion over the mountains. Then Fila smiled and said, "We shall name her Lionetta." And so they saw the mark of power upon her skin, but named her for the mark of her soul. Lionetta grew up surrounded by human care, but the lions that had once brought her to the cave did not forget their little ward. They often emerged from the forest at dawn and lay down by the threshold like mighty guardians of an ancient lineage. The girl played fearlessly with the lion cubs, hid in the tall grass, and laughed when they tugged at the hem of her dress with their soft paws. The enormous lion allowed her to sit upon his broad back and carried her at an unhurried pace between the pines, showing her secret paths, streams, and sunlit clearings. The old lioness taught Lionetta to listen to the forest, to distinguish the alarmed cry of a bird, understand a rustle in the bushes, and read tracks in the damp earth. But the girl did not become a savage. Fila taught her to spin, and Mulador taught her to tend the fire and be kind to people. Thus Lionetta absorbed the wisdom of two worlds, touching both the spindle and the golden mane of the Forest King with an open and innocent heart. So Lionetta grew between two worlds and each generously gave her its best. Fila taught her to spin the finest wool, embroider patterns resembling mountain flowers, and prepare simple, delicious food. Mulidor showed her hundreds of healing herbs, taught her to recognize them by scent and the shape of their leaves, and also to draw plants and animals on smooth river stones. But the lions taught her something different. Beside them, she learned that silence was not empty, but filled with peace, and that solitude held no terror for someone who knew how to be a kind friend to herself. They taught her to feel her own strength, and not to seek proof of her worth in the admiration of others. And so, within Lionetta's soul, human patience joined with a lion's courage, skillful hands with inner freedom, and kindness with quiet self-assurance, and a clear knowledge of her own path. At that very time, far across the seas on the Happy Isles, Prince Cockerico was growing up. His palace gleamed with marble, gold, and mirrors, yet held less freedom than the narrowest cage. After the early death of his father, a brave warrior king, Cockerico's mother became frightened of everything that reminded her of decisiveness. She repeatedly told her son that power corrupted the heart, responsibility brought misfortune, and every courageous deed could turn into cruelty. The prince received an excellent education. He spoke many languages, played the lute, and knew poems and ancient tales. He was taught to admire the feats of heroes in books, but forbidden even to dream of feats of his own. Thus Cockerico grew into a kind and educated young man, who could reason about any choice, but was afraid to make even one and accept its consequences. When Cockerico was 10 years old, his fate changed once again. One morning, he vanished from the palace on the Happy Isles without a trace. The powerful fairy Cornu, an old friend of his mother, transported the boy to her opal palace. This wondrous place seemed to possess neither walls nor weight. Its towers were woven from morning mist. Its staircases shimmered with the light of sunset, and its halls glowed with the delicate colors of opal. Everything there was flawlessly beautiful, yet nothing smelled of earth, aged or changed. Even the birds always sang the same songs. The gardens bloomed without fragrance, and the crystal fountains murmured without coolness. Cockerico's mother had agreed to this, hoping to shelter her son forever from worry, the throne, and the dangerous world. And so the first cage, created by her fears, was replaced by a second, woven from pure magic, but no more spacious for it. The fairy Cornu surrounded Cockerico with wonders that resembled the real world, but lacked its living breath. Talking maps told him about distant lands, seas, and cities, although he himself had never felt the wind of foreign roads. Musical instruments played without the touch of human hands, and so he never had to learn patiently how to draw sound from them. In the library, pictures stepped down from the pages and acted out battles, journeys, and celebrations. In the gardens, spring or winter arrived at a single wish, but the flowers had no scent, and the beautiful fruit had no taste. The greatest treasure was a miniature model of the globe. Upon it, Cockerico saw ships, palaces, battles, and human festivities. He knew the roads of the world by heart, but his feet had never felt road dust. He had seen battles, but his hands did not know the weight of a sword. Thus beauty replaced life for him, preventing him from truly touching it and choosing his own path. Cockerico came of age amid the opal radiance and became an extraordinarily intelligent, refined young man, learned in many sciences. He understood the language of the stars, remembered ancient verses, and knew how distant kingdoms were governed. But the broader his knowledge became, the more deeply an incomprehensible emptiness opened within him. More and more often, he felt like a spectator in the theatre of someone else's life. Battles, journeys, love and loss passed before him, but not one event touched him for real. Cornu's care imperceptibly became a claim of ownership over his fate. The fairy was certain that gratitude would one day make him choose her, for he did not know the real world and ought to fear it. But Cockerico's soul was already awakening. It was like a bird that had realized it possessed wings. And one day, a miniature sky was no longer enough for it. While Cockerico came of age in the shining halls of the Opal Palace, Mulidor noticed in the Caucasus Mountains that Lionetta had reached young womanhood. He then set out to seek advice in the forest of tigers from the ancient fairy Tigreline, patroness of mountain paths and wild beasts. The fairy met him beside a black stone and revealed a secret. Lionetta was the princess of the distant Golden Isle, hidden from a cruel queen who had stolen her throne. But then Tigreline's voice grew stern. Guard her heart. Until her 20th birthday, she must not give it to one who grew up in captivity and does not know true freedom. Otherwise, love will become a grievous trial for them both. Mulidor returned home in silence. He decided not to tell Lionetta the whole truth, lest the prophecy itself turn her life into another cage. At last, the fairy Cornu allowed Cockerico to leave the Opal Palace for a short time and see the real world. And so he found himself in the forests of the Caucasus, where he walked for a long time along a path, forgetting to watch his step as he marveled at every pine tree, cloud, and patch of sunlight. At that moment, Lionetta was stalking a young deer. She drew the bowstring and took aim, and just then, Cockerico stepped onto the path. The arrow whistled past the animal and merely grazed the prince's arm. He cried out more from surprise than pain. Horrified, Lionetta ran to him, quickly examined the wound, apologized profusely, took healing herbs from her satchel, and deftly bandaged his arm. Cockerico gazed at her, forgetting all about the scratch. He was struck by her beauty, her confident movements, and her wild, tranquil grace. Thus their acquaintance began, not with a bow, but with the twang of a bowstring. When the bandage was finished, Cockerico thanked the stranger, and slightly embarrassed, introduced himself as a shepherd travelling through the mountains in search of new pastures. Cornu had once ordered him never to reveal his name to strangers, and now that prohibition unexpectedly proved convenient. Beside Lionetta, he wanted to be not a prince, but simply a man. "And I am a huntress," she replied. "I live nearby and know these forests better than any road." Lionetta had never before met either princes or shepherds, and therefore did not know how to judge people by their clothing or rank. She saw only a young man with kind, slightly sorrowful eyes. And he saw a girl who spoke plainly and made no effort to please. And so a prince, weary of being a prince, and a princess unaware of her origins, met as two ordinary people. This simple truth became the beginning of their trust. Their love began not with balls and vows, but with quiet meetings by a forest spring. Nearly every evening, Cockerico arrived there first, and Lionetta appeared between the trees, with the scent of pine needles and wind in her hair. He told her about the stars, whose names he had learned from books, while she raised her face to the sky and showed him the real constellations. She spoke of animal tracks, bird song, and changes in the weather, and he shared the music of distant lands and ancient legends with her. Most often, however, they spoke of freedom, the fear of failing to fulfill the hopes of others, and the right to be oneself. For the first time, each of them had met someone beside whom there was no need to pretend. Thus, as they opened their different worlds to one another, they unknowingly created a single world of their own, and friendship became love. The time came for Cockerico to return to the Opal Palace. At the forest spring, where their friendship had begun, he held Lionetta's hands for a long time and assured her that their separation would be brief. "I will return," he said. "Then I will tell you the whole truth about myself and ask you to share my path." Lionetta removed her only ornament from her neck, a simple necklace of river pearls that she had gathered in the mountain streams. "This is not a chain meant to hold you," she said softly. "It is a promise and a guiding thread. Wherever fate may lead you, look at it and remember the road back to me." Cockerico accepted the necklace in both hands, as though it were the greatest of royal treasures. In every pearl he imagined their quiet evenings, their laughter, and the starlight. He did not know that this thread binding their hearts would soon become the thread of a grievous trial. Cockerico stood beside the forest spring, clutching the pearl necklace in his hands, and his heart was so full of happiness that all the old prohibitions seemed distant and powerless. Lionetta had entrusted him with her guiding thread, and he wanted to answer with an even more intimate gift: to reveal his true self to her. "You have given me what will lead me back," he said softly, "and I will entrust you with a name that no one has heard before this day." For a moment, the forest seemed to become still. Not a leaf stirred. The spring fell silent, and even the birds seemed to wait. Cockerico leaned toward Lionetta and spoke with tenderness, almost solemnly. "Cockerico." He thought he was placing the key to his heart in her hands. But at that same instant, somewhere in the invisible depths of the world, another key turned, and the door of human destiny began slowly to close. No sooner had the final sound of his name faded above the spring than the ancient spell awoke. To Lionetta, the word Cockerico did not sound like a human name. It burst in her ears as the sharp, piercing cry of a rooster, a battle challenge that made the leaves tremble and her heart contract. Everything the lions had taught her suddenly turned against her. The forest no longer seemed peaceful. The air grew thick, and the young man before her became a stranger and a danger. His face had not changed, and his eyes still gazed at her with love. But Lionetta could no longer recognize him. Deep within her being, an animal's ancient fear of an unknown threat awakened. She recoiled with a cry and pressed her hands over her ears. Cockerico took a step toward her, but the movement seemed like an attack. Unable to control herself, Lionetta fled into the dark thicket. Branches lashed her shoulders, and the familiar path became tangled beneath her feet. Thus their differences, which had once joined their hearts, became a weapon of separation. Far away in the Opal Palace, the fairy Cornu felt that Cockerico's heart belonged to another. At that very moment, she saw the forest clearing and the pearl necklace abandoned by the spring, and she understood everything. Rage rose within her like a cold wave, and the fairy sent her magic after the fugitives. Lionetta reached her home cave, barely able to catch her breath. Phila reached out to her, but the girl suddenly swayed, and golden fur spread over her body. A moment later, a beautiful young lioness with frightened human eyes stood before the old couple. And in the distant clearing, Cockerico felt the earth slip away beneath his feet. His arms became wings. His clothes became gleaming feathers, and a golden comb flared upon his head. Thus a lion's soul took on an animal body, while a name that sounded like a bird's cry became the bird itself. Their beauty remained, but their natures separated them forever on opposite sides. The curse proved far crueler than a simple transformation. It changed not only Lionetta's and Cockerico's bodies, but the very way in which they recognized one another. The lioness still cherished tenderness in her heart for the young man by the forest spring. But whenever the golden rooster cried out, the sound awakened two feelings within her: a primal fear of an unknown challenge, and a dark hunter's urge to catch the fleeing bird. Cockerico yearned for Lionetta with all his soul. Yet his light avian body froze at the sight of the predator's powerful paws, sharp claws, and golden eyes. His wings lifted him from the ground before his heart had time to recognize his beloved. And so they searched for one another, only to flee from one another every time. Their hearts reached out to meet, while their new bodies turned love into flight. This invisible war between soul and instinct became their most agonizing separation. They remained in the same forest, beneath the same sky, among the same familiar paths. Yet the curse made nearness more painful than a distant parting. Cockerico sat on the highest branch of an old oak. His golden feathers dimmed in the evening light, and his gaze was fixed below. Under the tree lay Lionetta, her head resting on her forepaws. She never took her eyes from the small, radiant bird above her. Only a few dozen paces separated them, but the slightest flutter of the rooster's wings made the lioness tense. And whenever she rose, he flew still higher in fear. Their hearts recognized each other, while their bodies commanded them to escape. So close and yet infinitely far apart, they seemed to live on opposite sides of an invisible chasm, not knowing how to take the first step without turning love into another flight. To break Lionetta completely, Cornu's magic dealt one final blow. One day, the lioness returned to her home cave, hoping to find at least a trace of its former warmth. But two beasts met her beside the extinguished hearth. An old gray-maned lion slowly rose to meet her. It was Mulidor. Beside him lay a weak, sick lioness, whose coat had lost its luster. It was Phila. They recognized their adopted daughter at once. Mulidor touched his forehead to hers. Phila pressed her side against her, and their quiet growls held the same love that had once lived in human voices. But they could no longer call her by name, embrace her with human arms, or tell her that everything might still be put right. Lionetta understood that the last thread connecting her to humankind had broken. Her quiet home had become another animal den, where grief spoke only through the rustle of fur and muted growls. Lionetta could no longer remain in a forest where every familiar voice reminded her of loss. Cockerico's cry awakened fear within her, while Mulador and Fila, now beasts themselves, could no longer help her with human words. At dawn she approached the cave, touched her forehead to the grey mane of her adoptive father, and quietly lay down beside her sick lioness mother. Then she said farewell to her forest family and set out upon an unfamiliar path. She was not wandering aimlessly. Something ancient, either a lion's instinct or a remnant of human memory, guided her over mountain passes, through dark forests, and across cold rivers, in a single direction known only to her. Lionetta was not seeking an easy release from the curse. She wanted to understand why love had become fear, and how she could live without betraying her own heart. Thus, for the first time, her solitude became not a punishment, but a journey. After long wanderings, Lionetta emerged from a rocky gorge and stopped before a place no human eye had ever seen. Beyond a silver fence stretched the Garden of Eloquence, hidden from the world by a faint, shimmering mist. Eternal spring reigned there. The air was filled with the fragrances of roses, lilies, violets, and flowering herbs, while clear streams murmured softly between the even paths. In this garden, there was no pursuit, no struggle, and no fear of the strong. But something else was even more wondrous. Every flower, bush, and tree could speak. Violets welcomed the lioness in delicate voices. Roses whispered words of comfort, and ancient cedars bowed their branches like wise hosts. No one was frightened by her claws or mane, and for the first time in her long journey, Lionetta felt that her heart had stopped waiting for danger. Worn out by the long road and her thirst, Lionetta approached a stream. The water flowed between white stones, clear as morning air, and chimed softly among the flowers. Suddenly its murmuring formed distinct words. "Drink of my water, child of two worlds, and you will regain the gift of speech." The lioness bent down and drank. Cool water touched her tongue, throat, and chest, as though washing away not only the dust of the road, but also the heavy curse of silence. Lionetta raised her head and tried to answer with her familiar growl. But instead, a clear human word emerged from her mouth. "Thank you." She froze, unable to believe what she had heard, then repeated it, now with tears of quiet joy. Her body was still that of a lioness, but her voice, clear and ringing, had returned. It was the first miracle and the first hope. Having regained her human voice, Lionetta made her way to the very heart of the Garden of Eloquence. There grew an enormous rose tree, so ancient that its roots seemed to remember the first words ever spoken in the world. Thousands of blossoms covered its branches, and each had its own fragrance. Lionetta lay down beside the mighty trunk and told it everything. About Cockerico, the forbidden name, the fear that had turned love into flight, and the lion's form that had become her prison. The tree listened for a long time, rustling its petals, and then said, "Your misfortune is not that you became a lioness, child. It began at the moment when another's voice seemed like a threat to you, merely because it was unlike your own. True love does not demand that the other dissolve into you. Sometimes to love means to accept the other's difference, not to hold on, but to allow that person to choose their own path." For the first time, Lionetta wondered whether the strongest bonds might be the ones that did not bind, but set free. The rose tree's words sank deep into Lionetta's soul. She remained in the garden of eloquence, and for the first time stopped asking when the curse would disappear. Instead of flight, she chose understanding. Every morning, Lionetta talked with the flowers, listened to the unhurried tales of the old cedars, and learned patience from the trees. She understood that she was not merely the victim of another's magic. The most important thing remained in her power: to decide who she would become within her lion's form. She no longer waited for a savior or sought only a way to regain her human body. She had to find her own wisdom and a kind of freedom that neither fear nor sorcery could take away. With each passing day, her heart grew calmer, clearer, and stronger. And so, in the speaking garden, Lionetta prepared herself to meet Cockerico. One day, not as a frightened lioness, but as his equal in spirit, capable of loving without losing herself. Meanwhile, far away in the forest of tigers, the fairy Tigreline found Cockerico transformed into a golden rooster. He was hiding among the roots of an old tree, tormented by fear and shame. The prince had lost Lionetta and his human form, and he did not understand why his happiness had turned to sorrow. Tigreline listened to him, but did not lift the enchantment. "Your trouble is not only the curse, Prince," she said sternly. "You have never been master of your own fate. First your mother decided what you should fear, and then Cornu chose what you should see, know, and desire. You are accustomed to obeying, and do not know how to say no at the right time." Cockerico begged her to restore his former form, but the fairy shook her head. "The magic will disappear only when you prove that you have found a will of your own." And so, instead of easy deliverance, Tigreline gave him the bitter medicine of truth. Tigreline led Cockerico to a dark lake and said, "The fairy Cornu has taken Lionetta's necklace. It holds the memory of your promise. You must return to the Opal Palace and retrieve it, but not by force. Her magic is more powerful than yours." You will need cunning and a steadfast will." Cockerico's golden feathers trembled at these words. To return to Cornu, disobey her, and take what she considered her own, all seemed nearly impossible. From childhood, he had been accustomed to thanking her, agreeing with her, and fearing her displeasure. But then the prince remembered Lionetta lying alone beneath the tree, and he understood that his former submission had already cost him too much. He spread his wings and set out. He had to return to his beautiful cage, but for the first time, not as a prisoner, but as one who had chosen the path himself. Cockerico returned to the Opal Palace, and the fairy Cornu greeted him with a radiant smile. "I knew the human world would disappoint you," she said. "You have come back to the place where you have always been loved." But the golden rooster raised his head and answered calmly, "I am grateful to you for the knowledge, protection, and years of care. But now I must speak the truth. Your gratitude was a cage, and your guardianship a prison. I have come not for you, but for something that belongs to Lionetta. Give me her necklace." Cornu turned pale. "After everything I have done for you, you dare make demands?" "I do not deny the good you did," he said, "but doing good does not give anyone the right to possess another's fate." The fairy reminded him of duty, ingratitude, and the dangers of freedom. To every one of her arguments, Cockerico answered with a firm no. With each refusal, the invisible chains of the past crumbled. For the first time, he stood before her not as a pupil or a prisoner, but as the master of his own will. Cornu gazed at Cockerico for a long time, as though hoping to see the obedient boy he once had been. But the one standing before her had already made his choice, and had no intention of retreating from it. The fairy understood that her power had rested not on magic, but on his submission, his fear, and his sense of obligation. Now those invisible chains were gone. With a cold, disappointed sigh, she held out the pearl necklace to him. Cockerico accepted it with care. He did not celebrate, argue, or remind her of her defeat. He merely bowed politely and made his way to the exit. He left the Opal Palace, which was no longer his prison. As he carried Lionetta's necklace with him, Cockerico also carried another treasure: the right to decide for himself whom to love, what to believe, and where to direct his life. Thus the obliging boy became a free man. Following Tigreline, Cockerico came to the Garden of Eloquence, no longer as a fugitive, but as one who had chosen his own path. Beside the rose tree, he saw Lionetta. She raised her head. A beautiful golden rooster stood before her, but his voice no longer awakened fear within her. Through the gleaming feathers, she saw a familiar soul, kind, vulnerable, and now free. Cockerico did not retreat either. In the mighty lioness with amber eyes, he no longer saw a predator. Before him was Lionetta, wise, strong, and beloved. They slowly approached one another. Neither asked the other to change, to become more convenient or easier to understand. Their eyes met, and between them remained only the quiet recognition of two wanderers who, having passed through fear and solitude, had finally learned to see with their hearts. At the moment when Lionetta and Cockerico drew close, a cold wind swept through the garden of eloquence. The flowers fell silent. The branches of the rose tree trembled anxiously, and the fairy Cornu appeared among the paths. When she saw the golden rooster beside the mighty lioness, she understood at once that Cockerico had chosen another over her once and for all. The fairy's face twisted with anger and jealousy. "So you chose her after all," Cornu hissed. "Very well. I can lift Lionetta's enchantment and return her human form." She paused, savouring the silence that followed. "But on one condition. You will return with me to the opal palace of your own free will, and remain there forever." Thus Cornu forged a trap from his own nobility. Either choice seemed like defeat: preserve his freedom and leave his beloved a lioness, or save her by surrendering himself to captivity once again. Cornu expected Lionetta to push Cockerico away in despair, or for him, following his old habit of duty, to surrender himself willingly. But their trials had already changed them both. Lionetta spoke first. A clear human voice emerged from the lioness's mouth. "No, his freedom is not for sale. I refuse this kind of rescue. Love is not a bargain or a sacrifice offered to another's will." Cornu turned sharply toward Cockerico, hoping to see hesitation. But the golden rooster spread his wings and answered firmly. "No, my freedom is not for sale, even to save the one I love. We will remain as we are if we must, but we will remain together and free." They stood side by side, refusing to let the fairy choose for them. Their two no's, spoken in the voices of a lioness and a rooster, rang out more powerfully than any spell. For the first time, love demanded no suffering, proof, or payment from them. Only the courage to remain true to themselves and to one another. At the moment when Lionetta and Cockerico rejected Cornu's condition together, her magic faltered. The enchantment which had fed for so long on fear, submission, and guilt suddenly lost its power. The garden filled with a soft golden light. It rose from the earth, enveloped the lioness and the rooster, and shone so peacefully that it seemed the morning itself had come to their aid. Lionetta felt the weight of her animal body disappear. Paws became hands. Her mane tumbled down as long hair, and a moment later, she once again stood before Cockerico as a human being. The prince's golden feathers flared and melted into the air. Wings became arms, and he returned to his human form. Cornu stepped back, understanding that she had been defeated, not by another's sorcery, but by their free will. Thus, through a simple choice, they broke each other's enchantment. To remain together, loving and free, without betraying themselves. No sooner had Lionetta and Cockerico regained their human forms than a new wave of golden light swept through the Garden of Eloquence. The old rose tree shuddered, its branches rose, petals swirled through the air, and the mighty trunk gradually transformed into a noble, gray-haired king. With tears in his eyes, he looked at Lionetta and called her his daughter. This was the king of the Golden Isle, her true father, whom the evil usurper queen had turned into a tree many years before. All this time, he had preserved the garden's wisdom and invisibly guided her path. At that same moment, Mulidor and Phila appeared among the flowers, once again in human form. They hurried to Lionetta and embraced her tightly. Thus the secrets of the past were revealed one after another. Lionetta found her father without losing those who had raised her, and both families were joined forever in her heart. The fairy Cornu silently gazed at the shining garden, at Lionetta standing between her true father and her adoptive parents, and at Cockerico, who now stood beside his beloved by his own choice. All her schemes had crumbled, yet no one raised a weapon against her. Then Cornu understood that magic fed by fear, obligation, and dependence was powerless wherever people knew how to choose freely and love without conditions. She had not been destroyed, but she had lost all power over them. The fairy slowly lowered her eyes. Without saying a word, she turned and took a step away. Her figure grew pale, became transparent, and dissolved into the air like morning mist. Thus Cornu departed alone, defeated not by force, but by wisdom. In a garden filled with freedom and love, no air remained for her sorcery. Lionetta and Cockerico did not hurry to travel to the Happy Isles and accept the crown. By mutual agreement, they remained in the Garden of Eloquence, which became not only their refuge, but also a place of new strength and quiet reflection upon all they had endured. Mulidor and Phila brought there the simplicity of a mountain home, the warmth of the hearth, and wise patience. From the lion's forest came freedom, courage, and the ability to listen to living nature. The heroes now returned to the Opal Palace only as free guests, taking from it knowledge, music, and art, while leaving its cold illusions behind. And the speaking garden taught them harmony, attentiveness, patience, and inner healing. Thus they gathered the best of the past, like a ripe harvest after a long winter. Before they placed crowns upon their heads, They had to weave a crown of their own, from mountain simplicity, a lion's strength, opal wisdom, and the tenderness of flowers. Only when Lionetta and Cockerico had completely healed and learned to listen to their own hearts did they accept the crown of the Happy Isles together. To them, it became neither a reward nor a birthright, but a shared responsibility they accepted freely. Cockerico brought deep knowledge, patience, and attentiveness to the smallest needs of the people to their rule. Lionetta brought courage, inner independence, and the ability to discern the living law of nature, where written rules fell silent. They did not try to remake one another, and never turned care into control. Each remained true to themselves, and so their differences did not divide them, but made their union stronger. The Happy Isles prospered under their wise rule, and the story of Lionetta and Cockerico became a legend. It reminded all who heard it that true love begins not when one person saves another, but when two people help each other find freedom and no longer fear it. They say that in ancient Cairo, in the days when people along the Nile still read fate in the movement of the stars, there ruled a king named Asim. The years silvered his hair, his palaces multiplied, and his treasury was full. Yet the king's heart remained empty. He had no heir. Then, after many prayers, the first cry of a baby rang out in the royal house. Sayf al-Muluk was born, and all of Egypt was illuminated with lights, music, and thanksgiving. But that same night, beneath the same stars, a miracle also entered the house of the faithful vizier Faris. A son named Said was born to him. Thus fate bound two cradles with an invisible thread. One boy was to inherit the throne, the other to become his support. From their first breath, they were destined to walk side by side, not as master and servant, but as brothers whose shared road would divide joy and sorrow between them. From their earliest years, Sayf al-Muluk and Said grew up together in the palace, as though they were not the son of a king and the son of a vizier, but two brothers to whom fate had given one childhood. Together they learned to wield a sword, tame spirited horses, and decipher the lines of ancient books that spoke of forgotten kingdoms and distant seas. Sayf was a dreamer. His gaze often wandered beyond the walls of Cairo, to where the unknown world began. Said, however, noticed what others passed by. A track in the sand, a shadow of doubt in a voice, a weak place in a suit of armor. He taught his friend patience and attentiveness, and Sayf taught Said not to fear the impossible. One was the wings, the other the anchor, and the older they grew, the clearer it became that their strength arose not from being alike, but from the care with which they complemented each other. One day, while hunting, Sayf al-Muluk stopped his horse and watched for a long time as an eagle circled high above the desert. Beyond the horizon, he imagined unknown islands, cities of blue stone, and lands where a person might find that perfect happiness which ordinary life could not offer. Meanwhile, Said dismounted and pointed to the barely visible track of a deer among the rocks. "The sky shows us where we wish to go," he said, "but the earth tells us how to get there." It was always so. Sayf saw the distance, but sometimes forgot the chasm at his feet. Said saw the road and was not afraid to stop his friend when a dream carried him away. He spoke the truth, even when it was unpleasant. Sayf sought answers in the stars, Said in the tracks upon the sand. One was an airship, the other its faithful anchor amid the storms of the earth. When Sayf al-Muluk and Said turned 7, King Asim summoned the finest astrologers in Egypt to the palace. Until dawn, they bent over circles of copper, ancient charts, and bowls of water in which the stars were reflected. At last, the eldest of them raised his head, and the hall fell silent. "We see neither easy glory nor a tranquil reign for these boys," he said. "The stars point them toward one long road, filled with separations, losses, and lands that do not appear on ordinary maps." But the prophecy held something else as well. When each of them was left without a home, without protection, and without the name he had always known, only their friendship would keep them from perishing. Thus the stars foretold not a throne for them, but a journey, and not power, but each other. Years passed, and the silver in King Asim's hair became more noticeable than the gold of his crown. Feeling old age draw near, he decided to give Sayf al-Muluk the right to rule while he could still stand beside him and guide him with his counsel. On the day of the ceremony, the throne room filled with lamplight, the scent of incense, and the soft ring of weapons. Before the nobles, Asim placed the royal mantle upon his son's shoulders and gave him the scepter and the keys to the treasury. Then he beckoned Sayf closer and brought out 2 ancient objects that had once belonged to King Solomon. The first was a heavy signet ring, whose seal commanded the spirits of the water. The second was a simple bundle of old cloth, tightly bound with a silk ribbon. None of the former kings had dared to open it. Thus the father gave his son power over the kingdom and a secret that proved heavier than the crown. Deep in the night, when the feasts, laughter, and wishes for a long reign had subsided, Sayf al-Muluk was left alone. In the quiet of his chambers, he took the old bundle, carefully untied the faded ribbon, and unfolded the cloth, as delicate as morning mist. Before him lay not a pattern, but an entire world. Beneath unfamiliar stars spread a garden where the leaves of a tall cypress gleamed silver, while jets of water rose from a marble fountain, glowing from within with blue fire. Beside the water stood a young woman of a beauty that no human kingdom could have produced. Her garments shone with the colors of the dawn sky, and distant stars seemed entangled in her dark hair. Above her head, embroidered in Arabic script, were the words, Badiat al-Jamal, daughter of King Shayal, sovereign of the jinn. It seemed that if he only touched the cloth, the fountain would begin to chime, the leaves would tremble, and the young woman would lift her eyes to him. Sayf looked not at an embroidery, but as if through a window into another world, where a living soul waited for him among silken threads. Yet the portrait did not blind Sayf al-Muluk with sudden passion. The longer he gazed into Badiat's embroidered eyes, the more strongly he felt not rapture, but a strange recognition, as though he had encountered a soul whose sorrow he had long carried within himself. Her gaze held neither a promise of happiness nor a plea for rescue. In it dwelled the deep loneliness of a person surrounded by splendor, yet denied the right to choose her own fate. Sayf thought that she too, the daughter of the king of the jinn, was bound by her father's expectations, the laws of her lineage, and the duty of a princess just as firmly as he was bound by the crown of Egypt. It seemed to him that Badiat was waiting not for a hero with a sword, but for someone to speak with, someone who would not worship her beauty, but would hear her silence. And so his heart responded not to the call of passion, but to the silent hope of finally being understood. The portrait would not release Sayf al-Muluk, but now he sought not love, but truth. By day he questioned sages, merchants, and travelers about the Garden of Iram, King Shayal, and the people of the jinn. Some laughed, others recalled vague legends, but no one knew the way. King Asim saw his son sinking ever deeper into the search, and one day he said, "Do not chase a shadow when a living kingdom lies before you." Sayf neither lost his temper nor renounced his duty. "Give me 1 year, father. If I fail to find even a single trace leading to her, I will return and forget this portrait forever." Asim was silent for a long time, then agreed. Sayf merely checked the straps on the traveling saddles. "I am going with you," he said, "to help you find the road, or bring you home in time." Before his departure, Sayf al-Muluk entrusted the affairs of state to the council, leaving the final word to his wise father. The palace was told that the young ruler was setting out to inspect distant lands, but only 3 people knew his true purpose. At night, when Cairo slept beneath the moon's silver light, Sayf and Said put on the simple clothes of merchants. Without guards, servants, or farewell trumpets, they passed through a small gate, leading 2 traveling horses by the reins. Beyond the city wall, a caravan bound eastward awaited them. None of the drovers guessed that the heir of Egypt and the son of the Grand Vizier were riding beside them. Thus they exchanged palace carpets for road dust and left their resounding names behind, to find one name embroidered upon an old piece of cloth. After long months of travel, the caravan reached China. An immense, clamorous world opened before Sayf al-Muluk. The streets flowed with streams of people. The markets rang with copper and porcelain, and roofs rose above the palaces, curved like the wings of unfamiliar birds. At court, they were received as wealthy foreign merchants. But no one bowed to Sayf as the heir of Egypt. No one recognized his name or asked about his crown. Here, he was merely one guest among many. For the first time, the young man felt himself not the center of the world, but a grain of sand in the boundless sea of human destinies. It did not humiliate him, but sobered him. He understood that the greatness of a country did not make a person great, and that a title carried no weight where one was judged by words and deeds. From that day on, he spoke more quietly, listened more carefully, and viewed his path without his former arrogance. Sobered by the Chinese court, Sayf al-Muluk understood that a miracle would not appear merely because it was awaited. Together with Said, he changed the very way they conducted their search. Now they did not ask about a magical garden or the beautiful daughter of the king of the jinn, but looked for traces that could be verified. The days passed in port archives, among faded sailing directions, ship's logs, and maps with half-erased shores. They spoke to grey-haired seafarers about strange lights over the water, to astronomers about unfamiliar constellations, and to cartographers about lands missing from new maps. They even questioned gardeners about cypresses that might grow beneath a different sky. Still, no answers came. But they continued, patiently sifting through heaps of other people's stories, in the hope of finding one grain of genuine truth. At last their patience was rewarded. In a small tea house by the harbour, Said struck up a conversation with an ancient captain whose eyes could barely distinguish light, but whose memory still held the seas of his youth. Upon hearing their questions about gardens that appeared beneath unknown stars, the old man was silent for a long time. Then he remembered a legend his grandfather had once told him. A phantom island was said to wander the Indian Ocean. It appeared amid the mists and vanished again, as though it were not bound to the earth. Once every 100 years, for a single night, a garden unknown to any map bloomed upon it. The captain did not know where to seek the island, but he said that the road to it began on the shores of Serendib. The thread was thin, almost invisible, and yet for the first time, the unknown had acquired a direction. Having found their first true lead, Sayf al-Muluk and Said fitted out ships and set sail upon the Indian Ocean, bound for the islands of Serendib. The voyage proved long and monotonous. The days followed one another, to the steady creaking of masts, the rustle of taut sails, and the soft splash of waves against the hull. In the mornings, the friends bent over their maps. By day, they watched the direction of the wind, and at night, they checked their course against unfamiliar southern stars. But most important of all were their evening conversations on deck. Beneath the immense dark sky, they spoke not of Badiat or treasures, but of home, their aging fathers, secret fears, and hopes they had once been ashamed to confess. Each listened to the other more attentively than he had ever listened to the sages at court. The ships sailed across the sea, time sailed through them, and amid the great blue silence, their friendship became the only dependable island. But one day, the calm sea changed before the sailors had time to take in the sails. The sky darkened, the wind struck the masts, and waves rose like walls, hiding the ships from one another. It was not evil magic, but the blind force of the elements, which knew neither kings nor human hopes. The fleet was scattered across the sea. Sayf al-Muluk's ship sprang a leak, and water flooded the deck. Through the rain and foam, he saw Said's vessel. The wind was carrying it the other way, straight into the heart of the storm. Sayf called to his friend, but the thunder swallowed his voice. He regained consciousness after the storm, in a small boat among several surviving sailors. Mist and endless water surrounded them. Neither the ships nor Said were anywhere in sight. For the first time in his life, Sayf was without his faithful anchor. After long days of wandering, Sayf al-Muluk's boat washed ashore on a flowering island. The coast there was fragrant with jasmine. Streams chimed among white stones, and above the gardens stood a house with open doors. A beautiful woman in silvery garments came out to meet the travellers. Such profound sorrow dwelled in her face that the sailors accepted the food, water, and lodging she offered without fear. That evening, their hostess asked her guests to tell her about their lives and sing the songs of their native lands. She listened with her eyes closed, as though gathering the rarest jewels. Yet as soon as a song ended, the singer discovered that he could no longer utter a sound. This was how the sorceress stole beautiful voices. She sealed their radiance in crystal vessels and left the silent people to serve in her luxurious house. Beautiful, obedient servants moved everywhere, but no laughter, footsteps, or whispers could be heard. Her hospitality proved to be a cage in which a person was deprived not of life, but of the right to tell of it. Sayf al-Muluk and the surviving sailors remained in the sorceress's house without chains, but also without voices. Marble halls, cool fountains, and fragrant gardens surrounded them. Yet all this beauty was only another especially artful form of captivity. Long years passed. The air of Egypt carried water in heavy pitchers, loosened the soil, pruned dry branches, and gathered fallen petals in the mornings. At first, every humble task seemed a humiliation to him. Then he ceased to measure his days by former titles and unfulfilled searches. Without Said, without a road, and even without his own voice, Sayf learned patience. He did not try to flee blindly. He watched, memorized the mistress's habits, and waited. In the great silence, he finally heard the grass growing, the clouds moving, and the steady beating of his heart. The dreaming prince gradually became a quiet man, capable of enduring long uncertainty. One day, while working near a distant shore, Sayf al-Muluk and his silent companions found an abandoned landing among the reeds. Beneath it lay the dark wreckage of old boats. The boards had been eaten away by salt, but some remained strong. Hope flared in the prisoners' hearts. They did not rise in revolt or betray themselves through haste. At night, when the sorceress fell asleep, the men gathered secretly by the sea. Some selected soundboards. Others bound them together with strong vines. And still others wove a small sail from palm leaves. By day, they continued working in the garden, discreetly setting aside fruit for the journey. They collected rainwater in large seashells and dried dates and slices of fruit in the sun. Their hands, accustomed to hoes and pitchers, began to remember the craft of freedom. Every knot tightened in the darkness gradually loosened their invisible bonds. When the raft was ready, it became clear that it could carry only a few people. Sayf al-Muluk, the strongest among the prisoners and a former captain, could have chosen 2 companions and left first. But the years of silence had taught him otherwise. With gestures, he explained to his companions that the weakest would depart on this raft. The others would build the next one. He himself would remain until the end. One after another, the little boats left the island. Sayf helped load water, reinforced the sails, and supported those who feared the sea. He watched each rescued person disappear beyond the horizon, and only then did he allow himself to step onto the final raft. At that moment, he became a king not by birthright, but by the right of his choice. He did not draw closer to his goal at the cost of another person's life, but proved that a true ruler is always the last to leave a sinking shore. The final raft drifted across the sea for a long time. At different shores, Sayf al-Muluk's companions went ashore until he was alone once more. At last, the waves cast him onto an island with golden cliffs and an immense flowering garden. There lived a young guardian surrounded by clever monkeys. They brought water, opened books, lit lamps, and wordlessly anticipated every wish of a guest. "Stay here, traveler," said the guardian. "Here there is food, quiet, workshops, and books. The outside world asks nothing of you, and you owe it nothing." After the long years of journeying and captivity, these words seemed more merciful to Sayf than any miracle. He listened to the rustle of the trees, felt the softness of the grass, and almost agreed. The island offered him oblivion, sweet as ripe fruit, and a peace he no longer dared hope he deserved. Sayf al-Muluk was ready to accept the guardian's offer. But in the stillness of the garden, Said's face suddenly appeared before him, vanishing behind a wall of rain. Then he remembered his father and his promise to return if the search failed to reveal even a trace of the truth. He understood that peace bought at the cost of forgetting would not heal his heart. It would merely become a new prison, spacious, bright, and therefore especially dangerous. "I thank you," Sayf said to the guardian, "but my journey is not yet over." The guardian did not try to detain him. There was respect in his gaze. He gave the traveler a small, swift ship with a sail of silver cloth. "A person is not obliged to finish every journey," he said, "but if he goes on, he must know what for." And Sayf once again chose the restless sea, for his true shore was still waiting ahead. The enchanted ship, with its silver sail, moved without a rudder, as though the wind of fate itself knew the way. At dawn, it carried Sayf al-Muluk to the shores of Serendib, where a slender castle of white stone rose above green cliffs, its towers almost touching the clouds over the sea. From the local people, Sayf learned that Princess Dalat Khatun lived there. She was held by Prince Hatim, son of the mighty Blue King. He caused his captive no pain and surrounded her with luxury and servants. But he had placed the castle under a spell of stillness. No one could enter, and no one could pass beyond its walls. In that castle, the same flowers were always in bloom. The clocks always showed the same hour, and each new day repeated the one before it. Dalat Khatun's prison was woven not of stone, but of time forbidden to move. Sayf al-Muluk raised the hand that bore King Solomon's ring, and the motionless air before the castle trembled like water. The magical barrier parted, allowing him into a place no human being had entered for years. Dalat Khatun met the stranger with alarm, but soon heard in his words not the self-assurance of a rescuer, but the quiet nobility of a traveler. Then she revealed a secret to him. "I have not been sitting idly by," said the princess. "All these years I have watched Hatim. He is strong only because he ceased to be whole long ago. Fearing death, he removed his true name from himself and hid it in 7 caskets at the bottom of the sea. While the name remains hidden, he is invulnerable and can bind another's will. But if it is returned to its owner, Hatim will become an ordinary mortal. Daulat was not waiting for a sword. She needed someone capable of finding the lost name. At dawn, Sayf al-Muluk went down to the sea and understood that King Solomon's ancient ring had been given to him not for power, but for this hour. He stepped into the cold water, raised his hand, and spoke words that opened not locks, but the memory of the depths. The sea trembled and parted into two transparent walls. On the exposed seabed lay a casket of alabaster. Within it was one of malachite, followed by silver, amber, coral, crystal, and at last a tiny one of mother of pearl. Sayf opened the final casket. Inside there was neither gold nor an imprisoned soul, only a small blue feather that shimmered like a living drop of sky. This was Hatim's true name. Sayf held another person's essence in his palm. He could have crushed the feather and destroyed his enemy forever. But the years of trials had taught him that power over another's life did not make a person just. And so he decided to return to Hatim, the very thing Hatim himself had once feared. Sayf al-Muluk returned to the frozen castle and found Hatim in a hall where blue lamps burned without a flicker. In his palm lay the blue feather, another man's name and another man's life. With a single motion, he could have crushed it and ended the captor's power forever. But Sayf held the feather out to Hatim. "I did not come to kill you," he said, "but to return what you lost." Trembling, Hatim touched the feather. It dissolved into blue light and entered his chest. For the first time in many years, he became whole. Along with his name, his conscience returned to him, and he saw with horror what he had made of Daulat Khatun's life. Without saying a word, Hatim lifted every spell from the castle, bowed deeply to Sayf, and went into voluntary exile. Thus mercy restored his soul and punished him more severely than vengeance. The freed Daulat Khatun returned with Sayf al-Muluk to her native kingdom of Serendib. Thousands of lamps were lit in the palace, music played in the squares, and the people celebrated the princess's return. Sayf went to walk through the bustling market. Among the merchants, spices, and brightly coloured fabrics, he suddenly noticed a poorly dressed man selling scrolls in an artist's shop. The familiar tilt of his head made Sayf stop. "Said?" The man raised his eyes. In the next instant, the friends embraced, scarcely believing that fate had brought them together again. Said told him that he had survived a shipwreck and spent long years searching for the road home. He had lost everything except a copy of the old cloth bearing Badiat's portrait. By making drawings from it and selling them, he earned his bread along the long road. Thus the portrait that had led them away from Egypt saved Saeed's life and brought the friends back to each other. That evening, after the sounds of celebration had faded, Sayf al-Muluk and Saeed told Dalat Khatun everything that had brought them to Serendib. Sayf spoke once more of the young woman in the embroidered portrait, and for the first time said her name. Dalat smiled. So this is the one for whom you crossed seas, endured captivity, and spent years in silence. You did not tell me before that you were searching for Badiat al-Jamal. Sayf froze. She is my foster sister, the princess continued. Our mothers were close friends. When they were young, they met in a secret garden between worlds, and Badiat and I grew up together. I know the road to her kingdom. After long years of blind searching, a clear path finally opened before Sayf, and he understood that fate had not led him in circles, but along an invisible map, from one sister to the other. Overcome with joy, Sayf al-Muluk leaped to his feet and asked Dalat Khatun to open the way at once. But the princess looked at him without a smile. I can open a door for you, Sayf, she said, but remember, Badiat is not a reward for your years of wandering, nor a trophy awarded to the victor. Neither the sea, nor captivity, nor mercy gives you a right to her heart. Sayf lowered his eyes, and Dalat continued. She is a queen with a will, fears, and a destiny of her own. The one who enters her presence must not be a hero of legend who has come to take away the girl from a portrait, but a man prepared to see a living woman and hear her answer, whatever it may be. Then Sayf understood that the most difficult road led from the beautiful image on silk to a soul that owed nothing to anyone. Sayf al-Muluk silently accepted Dalat Khatun's words. He understood that what awaited him was not a reward for all he had endured, but a meeting whose outcome he had no right to demand in advance. The following night, Dalat's mother, the old queen of Serendib, led Sayf, Saeed, and her daughter to a secret garden at the top of the palace. Amid dark cypresses and motionless white flowers stood an incense burner carved from moonstone. The queen opened a small casket. It held incense that Badiat al-Jamal's mother had left her many years before. She placed a pinch upon the glowing coals. Thick silver smoke, fragrant with lotus and sandalwood, rose toward the night sky. It did not scatter in the wind, but slowly folded itself into a slender, shining road. It was not merely a fragrance, but a silent letter sent from the human world to the kingdom of the jinn. The silver smoke thickened above the garden, and two women stepped from it as though emerging from morning mist. Badiat al-Jamal's mother came first, followed by the princess herself, as beautiful as in the embroidered portrait, yet wholly unlike its silent sorrow. Her gaze was wary, clear, and commanding. The old queen of Serendib explained why she had summoned them. A mortal prince had crossed half the world, guided by her image alone. A portrait? Badiat repeated coldly. Then he fell in love not with me, but with an artful embroidery and the legend he invented around it. She looked at Sayf without delight, almost with irritation. Badiat did not wish to become a dream brought to life, or a reward for another person's deeds. She wanted to know whether he could see her true will beyond her beauty. She stepped out of the smoke, not as a promised bride, but as a judge, and her first glance was a question. Dalat Khatun asked only one thing of her sister: not to pass judgment before they had spoken. That same evening, Sayf al-Muluk and Badiat were left alone in the garden, where water chimed softly between the dark cypresses. "What did you see in that portrait, mortal?" she asked coldly. "My beauty? Did you truly cross the seas for its sake?" Sayf remembered Dalat's warning and answered without flattery. "I saw not beauty, but loneliness. The same loneliness that lived in me for many years. It seemed to me that I was looking at a person imprisoned by the expectations of others, as if in the highest tower. I did not set out to conquer you or demand a reward. I only wanted to learn whether I was mistaken." Badiat was silent for a long time. She had expected vows and rapture, but heard the echo of her own sorrow. For the first time, she looked at him not as a petitioner, but with genuine interest. On the second evening, Sayf al-Muluk and Badiat met in the garden again. The former coldness was no longer in her gaze, and the silence between them had grown more peaceful. "You are the daughter of the king of the jinn," Sayf said. "You can fly between worlds. Why did you not leave your world if you were so lonely?" Badiat considered his question. "Because the ability to leave does not yet mean freedom. My father expects me to make an advantageous marriage, and my people expect a flawless princess from the legends. I can vanish into any world, but freedom without a place where one can return and be awaited is also a form of exile." Sayf told her of the crown, his duty to Egypt, and his fear that one day he might live someone else's life. Thus the prince of humans and the princess of the jinn understood that their golden cages had been built in different worlds, but the locks upon them were the same. On the third evening, Sayf al-Muluk and Badiat spoke no longer of the past, but of the future. Their conversation held no easy vows. They asked each other how they could unite two worlds without destroying either one. Who would learn the other's language and customs? How could Sayf rule Egypt without turning Badiat into a guest at his court? How could she fulfill her duty to the jinn without disappearing for many years? And what would become of them when his human life began to draw towards sunset, while her years remained almost unchanged? They had no ready answers, but each saw that the other did not avoid difficult questions or demand sacrifice only from the one they loved. And so their yes was spoken quietly. They chose not a cloudless fairy tale, but a road they were ready to build together. For Sayf al-Muluk's union with Badiat to be recognized in the world of the jinn, Marjana carried the prince through the clouds to the garden of Iram and the princess's ancient grandmother. the guardian prepared 3 quiet trials for him. First, Sayf had to listen to the birdsong and rustling leaves, without interrupting the garden with stories of his own exploits. Then she placed the golden sandals of the first queen of the jinn in his hands. But he asked for neither power nor wealth in return. At last, the old woman asked, "Will you be able to let Badiat go if one day she chooses a life without you?" Sayf was silent for a long time. "If I love her as a free woman, then I cannot make her a prisoner, even of my love." Then the guardian blessed their union. He passed the trials of silence, gold, and possible loss, proving that he had come not for a magical wife, but for an equal soul. News of Sayf al-Muluk's union with Badiat and of Hatim's fate reached the mighty Blue King. Blinded by anger, he ordered Sayf seized and demanded an answer for the humiliation of his son. But it was not a company of warriors that appeared before the court of the 2 worlds. It was King Shayal, Badiat's father, who came to defend his daughter's guest. Sayf neither recited his deeds nor begged for mercy. He calmly told how Hatim had held Dalat Khatun through fear and deprived her of freedom. Then he added that he could have destroyed Hatim's true name, but had chosen instead to restore the Blue King's son to wholeness and give him the right to choose his own path. Dalat confirmed every word. The Blue King was silent for a long time. He understood that revenge would not bring Hatim back and would only multiply the pain. So he let Sayf depart in peace, preserving his honor not through war, but through justice. Sayf al-Muluk and Badiat sealed their union in the garden of Iram, beneath trees whose branches touched the stars. Their vows were quiet, not to possess one another, not to demand that either abandon their duty, and always to leave room for freedom beside them. Saeed and Daulat Khatun also found a rare understanding in each other, but they did not hurry to marry. Both knew that a heart which had endured separation and captivity needed time to learn to trust again. Sayf did not remain forever among the jinn, nor did Badiat go to Egypt as a beautiful trophy. They created 2 homes, one in Cairo, where Sayf ruled wisely, and the other near the Garden of Iram, where Badiat served her people. A secret road of stars ran between the 2 homes. They travelled it together, creating a 3rd world, their own. Sayf al-Muluk and Badiat ruled long and happily, travelling the starry road from the world of humans to the world of the jinn. In Cairo, they visited the aging King Asim, and in the Garden of Iram, they welcomed Saeed and Daulat Khatun, whose friendship in time became a quiet and enduring union. The old embroidered portrait no longer lay among gold and rare jewels in the royal treasury. It was hung in a simple room beside a fountain, where only water and the rustle of leaves could be heard. Now it was neither a sacred object nor an image of unattainable perfection, but a map of the road they had travelled. It reminded them that beauty may point the way, but love is born only when a person recognizes a living soul, with its will, fears, and imperfections, listens to it, and chooses it freely every day.